horror story about the Morrison twins, written in a way that's clear, engaging, and atmospheric, perfect for an American YouTube audience. Ha! The Morrison Twins, Part 1, The Arrival. In the forgotten hills of eastern Kentucky, where the mist clings to the valleys like ghosts of the past, there's a story that has haunted historians and locals alike for nearly 200 years. The year was 1834, and a man named Reverend Ezekiel Morrison arrived in a remote place called Pine Hollow, a tiny Baptist community hidden deep in the Cumberland foothills. He wasn't alone. With him were his 9-year-old twin daughters, Rebecca and Rachel, two little girls who would soon become the center of one of the strangest cases ever recorded in early American history. We know what happened because of a rare discovery made in 1987 when the old church at Pine Hollow was being torn down. Hidden beneath the pulpit was a leather-bound journal written by the town's pastor, William Phillips. That journal described 3 days of events so eerie, so precise, that even modern scientists and psychologists can't explain them. The Morrison twins didn't just make strange predictions. They knew things, deep, personal, and hidden things. They spoke of tragedies from long ago. They described people they'd never met. And every single thing they said turned out to be true. This channel isn't for the faint of heart. If you're brave enough to explore the mysteries that challenge science, history, and everything we think we understand, subscribe now and tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? Because what happened in Kentucky might not be so far from your home. Let's begin. Kentucky, 1834. This was a time when wild land still stretched far and wide. Pine Hollow was a hard-to-find place, settled by just a few families who wanted to escape the growing arguments between churches in bigger towns. By 1834, the entire community was no more than 200 people, nearly all of them related by blood or marriage. At the heart of it all was a simple wooden church, built by hand from the trees that surrounded them. Pastor William Phillips, a man who once lived in the city of Lexington, gave up everything for this quiet life in the hills. He was a man of books and order, writing down every major event in the community, births, deaths, marriages, and eventually the Morrison story. The mysterious Reverend and his daughters. Reverend Ezekiel Morrison was known along the rough preacher's trail of the Appalachian frontier. He was tall, serious, and looked older than his 34 years. He had spent nearly a decade walking from town to town with his daughters, carrying nothing more than a Bible, a satchel, and his own private journal. His wife had died giving birth to the twins during a brutal winter storm. Since then, he had raised them alone. Rebecca and Rachel were identical in appearance, but opposite in personality. Rebecca, the older twin by just a few minutes, was outgoing and full of energy. She had a bright smile and loved talking to anyone who would listen. Rachel was quiet, watchful, and mysterious. She hardly spoke, but when she did, her words left people uneasy. Some said the Morrison family had a strange power. After their visits, churches seemed to grow stronger. People who had lost faith found it again. Old feuds ended. But the real changes always seemed to follow private talks with the twins. And what they said in those conversations was never recorded until Pine Hollow.
Arrival at Pine Hollow?
It was November 15th, 1834, when the Morrisons arrived, just as Pastor Phillips was finishing evening prayers. It had been a hard journey, cold rain, muddy trails, and Rachel was sick with a fever. Ezekiel had carried the last 5 miles. They looked exhausted, clothes dirty from travel, boots worn thin. Rachel was pale. Rebecca's usual spark was dim, but Pastor Phillips noticed something odd in their eyes, something too sharp, too aware for girls their age. It made him uneasy. That night, over a simple meal with the Phillips family, Rebecca asked the pastor's wife about her roses, specifically the ones near the eastern fence that almost died from a blight 3 years ago. Mrs. Phillips dropped her spoon. No one outside Pine Hollow knew about the rose blight. It had happened 3 years earlier, and it had nearly killed her entire garden. She had told no one but her husband. When asked how she knew, Rebecca simply smiled and said, "I dreamed about roses while we were walking. I just knew yours were the prettiest."
Yeah.
Secrets that shouldn't be known. The next morning, the wind howled through Pine Hollow. Pastor Phillips rose early and found Ezekiel awake by the fire, looking worried. Ezekiel explained the girls had disturbing dreams the night before, visions of the church, of something hidden. Before the pastor could reply, Rebecca appeared, her face serious. "Pastor Phillips," she said, "in your church, under the third floorboard from the altar, something's hidden that shouldn't be." The blood drained from Phillips's face. He had hidden something there. A bottle of whiskey, a sin he had confessed to no one but God. Wrapped in his infant son's old blue blanket buried beneath the floor 3 months ago, he kept it close as a test to resist temptation each day. No one else knew. Then Rachel stepped forward quietly and said, "The bottle is brown, and the cloth is blue. It was once a baby's blanket." Phillips couldn't speak. His hands trembled. This was only the beginning. Part 2 will reveal what the twins saw in the church the next day, something that shook the entire town to its core. Don't miss it. Continuation. Below is a rewritten version of Part 2, formatted for a 20-minute, wave-minute narrated YouTube video, using atmospheric, vivid and emotionally gripping language tailored for an American audience. This continues directly from Part 1, building tension while keeping the storytelling simple, clean and engaging. The Morrison Twins, Part 2. Secrets of the Church. The fire in Pastor Phillips's hearth had nearly gone cold, but the chill he felt didn't come from the wind outside. He sat trembling, the bottle still hidden beneath the church floorboards, burning in his memory. The blue cloth wrapped around it wasn't just any fabric. It had been part of a baby blanket, a blanket that once belonged to the son he and his wife had lost 5 years earlier. He had placed it there himself, wrapped around that bottle of temptation as a silent punishment, a reminder of the child he couldn't save and the man he still couldn't forgive. And now, 2 9-year-old girls had uncovered that secret without ever stepping foot in the church. Reverend Ezekiel Morrison watched Phillips's reaction with the quiet wariness of a man who had seen this all before. "It started when they were very young," he said gently. "At first, I thought it was just childhood intuition, but over time their knowing became too clear, too accurate. There's no natural explanation for it anymore."
The Sunday that changed everything.
The next morning, a cold Sunday dawned over Pine Hollow, the sky heavy with clouds and the ground hard with frost. Inside the little wooden church, the congregation gathered. The room was filled with the familiar scent of smoke and pine wood, the creaking of pews under wool coats and heavy boots. Reverend Morrison's sermon was fiery, a heartfelt call for confession and spiritual renewal. People wept, some prayed louder than usual, but it wasn't the sermon they would remember. It was what happened after. As the final hymn ended and people began to gather their things, Rebecca walked straight up to Samuel Turner, one of the wealthiest and most respected men in the community. She looked up at him with innocent eyes and said, "Mr. Turner, the money you've been taking from the church collection, it's not really stealing if you put it back, is it? Papa says God forgives those who repent." The blood drained from Turner's face. He had been secretly taking money from the collection plate for 6 months, small amounts to cover debts from a failed investment. No one had noticed. He had promised himself he'd pay it all back, eventually. But now, a little girl had peeled the truth from him like she was reading it off a page. Before he could say a word, Rachel stepped beside her sister. Her quiet voice was calm, almost caring, as she turned to Mrs. Martha Whitfield, the town's moral anchor. "Your husband didn't die in a farming accident, did he?" Rachel asked. "He's still alive somewhere. That's why you hide the letters." Martha nearly collapsed. She had lied for 15 years, claiming her husband had died to protect her children from the shame. In truth, he had taken their savings and disappeared in the night. The letters he sent from Missouri were hidden deep in her home, read only in silence and never spoken of aloud. Whispers and wounds. One by one, the Morrison twins moved through the congregation. To Dr. Hayes, they spoke of patients who had died, not from illness, but from his lack of proper medical training. To the Miller family, they mentioned the hidden son in their attic, a boy with a simple mind kept out of sight to avoid embarrassment. To young Thomas Brett, they described in perfect detail his secret meetings with Elizabeth Carter, a married woman whose husband travelled for work. Each secret was spoken softly, without judgment. The girls' tone never changed. It was as if they were talking about chores or weather. But what they said shattered lives. People froze. Some wept, a few gasped, no one spoke. And then Rebecca walked to the front of the church, slowly, her small hand reaching out to rest on the wooden cross above the altar. "This is sacred ground," she said, "but it's been stained by what happened here before." Then her eyes locked onto Pastor Phillips. "The Whitman family didn't die in a house fire, did they, Pastor? They died right here, in this room, and some of you know exactly why."
The hidden tragedy.
The silence that followed was unbearable. Pastor Phillips gripped the pulpit, face pale, knuckles white. The Whitmans. That name hadn't been spoken in years. Back in 1818, when Pine Hollow was still just a handful of cabins in the wilderness, Jacob Whitman had been the community's blacksmith and de facto leader. His wife Mary was the healer, the midwife, and the heart of the village. Their daughters, Hope and Faith, were 9 years old, bright, beautiful twins who sang in the church choir and helped their mother deliver babies. The official story, passed down like scripture, was that the Whitman family died in a house fire during a snowstorm. Their bodies were found in the ashes, buried with ceremony. The town mourned, rebuilt, and carried on. But now Rebecca's voice, clear and calm, told a different story, one that some in that room had kept buried for 16 years. From the back of the church, Elder Thompson, one of Pine Hollow's founding members, stood with effort. His voice was slow, heavy. "Child, you speak of things that happened before you were born, in places you've never seen. How can you possibly know?" Rebecca looked at him without fear. Faith had a birthmark on her left shoulder. Hope had one on her right ankle. Faith carried a wooden doll. Hope wore a silver locket with their mother's hair. The room gasped. Those details had never been written down. They weren't part of any public record. Elder Thompson's wife clutched his arm, tears in her eyes. And then Rachel spoke. "They didn't die in a fire. They came here to the church. Someone was hunting them. They hid behind the altar, but they were found." The sanctuary went deathly still. The past unearthed. Pastor Phillips's mind raced. He remembered whispers, sideways glances, odd flowers placed at a blank grave. For years, people had changed the subject when the Whitmans came up. Then Samuel Turner, still shaken from his own exposure, stood and shouted, "This is madness! These girls are lying!" But even as he spoke, other voices chimed in. Mrs. Carter, mother-in-law to Elizabeth, mentioned bloodstains on the church floor, ones that wouldn't wash away. Benjamin Foster, old and half-blind, spoke of hearing children crying in the church at night. And then Hayes stepped forward, suddenly remembering something. 3 years ago, he said, when I helped repair the eastern wall, we found bones. Small fragments mixed in with the mortar. His words hit the congregation like thunder. If the Whitmans died in the church, if their bodies were hidden in the walls, then every prayer, every sermon, every baptism had happened over their graves. What kind of gift? Ezekiel Morrison had stood silent all this time, arms folded, eyes heavy with pain. He had seen this before. In other towns, other churches, his daughters didn't just guess, they revealed. Pastor Phillips turned to him, voice weak. "Mr. Morrison, how do your daughters know these things? What kind of gift is this?" Ezekiel looked around at the faces, shocked, broken, terrified. "I've asked myself that same question," he said quietly. "Every day for years. Part 3 will uncover what happened on the final night of the Morrison family's stay in Pine Hollow and the terrifying price of knowing too much. Subscribe and tell us, would you have stayed in that church after the twins spoke? Here's part 3 of the Morrison Twins, rewritten in a detailed, atmospheric and emotionally engaging way for a 20-minute dark mystery horror video suited to an American audience. This part follows the chilling revelations in the church and explores the final night the Morrisons spent in Pine Hollow when things crossed from eerie to unholy. The Morrison Twins Part 3. The final night in Pine Hollow. By the time the sun set over Pine Hollow that evening, the small wooden church at the edge of town no longer felt like a house of God. It felt like a house of secrets. Inside, the air was thick with fear and questions. Outside, the hills seemed darker than usual, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The Morrison twins had exposed something old, something rotten buried deep in the bones of that church. Not just the truth about the Whitman family, but about the people who had buried that truth for 16 years. Now those same people were left staring at each other, wondering who else had lied, wondering what else the twins knew.
Uneasy.
That night, Pastor Phillips barely touched his dinner. His hands shook when he tried to lift his fork. His mind wouldn't stop replaying the things the girls had said and the look in their eyes when they spoke. They didn't guess, he whispered to himself. They knew. Across the table, Ezekiel Morrison sat quietly, eating slowly while his daughters remained silent. Rachel stared into her stew, while Rebecca seemed distracted, looking toward the window every few moments as if expecting someone to appear out of the darkness. Mrs. Phillips tried to keep things normal, fussing over bread and soup, but her smile was strained. Their children, 2 boys and a girl, sat silently, watching the twins with a mix of fear and fascination. Finally, Ezekiel broke the silence. "We'll leave in the morning," he said softly. Pastor Phillips looked up. "You don't have to." "Yes," Ezekiel interrupted gently. "We do." That night, a storm rolled in, the kind that doesn't bring rain, just cold air and sharp wind that howls through cracks in old wood and rattles shutters like bones against bone. In the loft above the Phillipses' home, the twins lay awake. Rachel stared at the ceiling. Rebecca sat on the edge of the bed, eyes wide, hands clenched in her lap. "They're coming," she said quietly. Rachel didn't ask who. She already knew.
The visitor.
2:13 a.m. Pastor Phillips was awakened by a soft knocking at the front door. At first he thought it was the wind, but the knock came again, 3 slow, deliberate taps. He lit a candle and opened the door cautiously. No one was there. But as he stepped outside, something caught his attention. Footprints in the frost. Bare feet. Small feet walking toward the woods. But they weren't from either of the twins. These feet were too small, even for 9-year-old girls. And there were only 2 sets walking side by side away from the house toward the old church. He turned to call for Ezekiel, but something stopped him. A sound, like giggling, childlike, far away but echoing on the wind. He followed it.
"The church at night!"
The door to the church creaked open on its own. Inside, the sanctuary was dark, but not empty. Pastor Phillips stepped inside, candle flickering. At the front of the room, near the altar, 2 figures stood in the moonlight. Not Rebecca and Rachel, but 2 other girls, their backs turned, long hair hanging down their backs. They held hands. One wore a nightgown, the other a blue dress. Phillips couldn't speak. His throat went dry. Then one of them turned her head just enough for him to see her face.
Hope Whitman. And the other,
Faith. The girls who had died 16 years ago. Their faces were pale, eyes hollow but not empty. They stared at him, not with hate but with something sadder, like disappointment. "You let them do it," Hope whispered. "You knew and you said nothing," said Faith. Philip stepped back in horror, but when he blinked, the girls were gone. In their place stood Rebecca and Rachel, watching him with calm expressions. "You weren't supposed to see that yet," Rachel said, "but they wanted you to." The truth comes out. Back at the house, Ezekiel was waiting on the porch. He saw Pastor Phillips stumbling out of the woods, shaking, candle melted down to his fingers. Phillips dropped to his knees. What are they?" he whispered. "Your daughters. What are they?" Ezekiel crouched beside him. "They're children, Pastor, but they're also something more, something I don't fully understand." He looked up at the sky. "They don't call it a gift. They never have. It's like a door in their minds opened the moment they were born, and sometimes something steps through." "Something good?" Phillips asked. "Sometimes," Ezekiel said. "Other times, no." Inside the house, the girls stared out the window. They didn't blink. The final vision. As the wind screamed outside and branches slapped the house, Rachel spoke. "Tomorrow," she said, "the church will burn." Rebecca nodded, her voice hollow. "And it'll be better that way." The morning after. The storm had passed, but the wind hadn't. Just before sunrise, Pastor Phillips heard the bell ringing from the church tower, but no one was supposed to be there. He raced down the hill, coat flapping behind him, and what he saw made him fall to his knees. The church was on fire. Flames poured from the roof. The cross atop the steeple cracked and fell, landing with a thud that shook the ground. Villagers gathered, shouting, throwing water that did nothing. No one saw anyone enter the church. No one had started the fire, and yet it burned perfectly. The pews, the altar, the floorboards hiding the bottle, all of it. By noon, nothing remained but ash and scorched stone.
Archer!
Later that afternoon, Ezekiel and his daughter stood at the edge of Pine Hollow. A small crowd had gathered to watch them leave. Rebecca looked tired. Rachel clutched her father's hand. Pastor Phillips approached slowly. "If they're not angels," he asked Ezekiel, "then what are they?" Ezekiel looked at his daughters, then back at Phillips. Maybe they're just the kind of messengers God sends when we stop listening to the quiet ones. Rebecca stepped forward and whispered, "Some places have too many secrets. Some truths want to be known." Rachel added, "And some souls don't rest until they are." And with that, the three of them disappeared into the woods just as quietly as they had arrived.
Epilogue. The ashes.
That night, as Pastor Phillips walked alone through the blackened ruins of the church, he stopped at the place where the altar used to stand. There, untouched by flame, was the silver locket that once belonged to Hope Whitman, and lying beside it, a wooden doll with a broken arm. The fire had destroyed the building, but some things refused to burn. In part 4, we uncover what happened to the Morrisons after they left Pine Hollow, and how the girls' next destination would mark the beginning of something even more terrifying. Of course, here's part 4 of the Morrison Twins, rewritten in a vivid, atmospheric, and easy-to-follow style, crafted to engage an American YouTube audience for a 20-minute mystery horror video. This chapter picks up after the burning of the Pine Hollow Church and follows the Morrison family to their next stop, where what follows is no longer just eerie, but deadly.
The Morrison Twins, Part 4.
The widow's house. When the Morrisons left Pine Hollow, the smoke from the church fire still drifted over the valley like a ghost refusing to move on. Behind them, the town was silent, stunned, as if waking from a nightmare it had chosen to forget. But for Ezekiel, Rebecca, and Rachel, there was no waking up. Their journey continued, south this time, toward a place Ezekiel had been summoned, a small village called Fairwood Gap, nestled deep in a hollow near the Tennessee border. It wasn't even a proper town, just a few scattered farms, a shuttered schoolhouse, and a faded wooden chapel that hadn't seen a pastor in nearly a decade. But someone there had written to Ezekiel months ago. A letter signed simply, "Please come. My home is not clean. My dreams are not mine."
Mrs. Agnes Bellwether.
Agnes Bellwether was a widow in her late 60s, childless, thin as bone, with sharp grey eyes and a limp that made her cane thump rhythmically on the porch floorboards. She lived alone in a 2-story house that leaned slightly to one side, surrounded by dying trees and rotting fences. It looked more like a place someone escaped from than lived in. She greeted the Morrisons with a mixture of relief and dread. "I prayed you wouldn't come," she muttered, "but I knew you would." Inside, the house smelled of damp wood and lavender, like a grandmother's parlour left untouched for years. Portraits lined the walls, sepia photos of long-dead relatives staring down with blank, silent eyes. The parlour clock had no hands. The mirrors were all covered in cloth. Rebecca glanced at one of the draped mirrors and whispered, "It doesn't like being looked at." Agnes froze. "Which it do you mean?" she asked, voice shaking. Rachel answered softly, "The one that knocks on the inside of the mirror when you sleep."
Night whispers.
That first night, Ezekiel and the twins stayed in the guest room upstairs. Rebecca refused to lie down at first. She stood by the window, watching the trees sway without wind. Rachel sat cross-legged on the floor, humming softly. Downstairs, Agnes poured herself a small glass of bourbon, her only vice, she said, but her hands trembled so badly she spilled half of it. She told Ezekiel what had been happening. "It started with the sounds," she said. "Tapping at first, in the walls, the voices. What do they say?" Ezekiel asked. "They don't speak English," she replied, "but I understand them anyway." "And what do they want?" Agnes went silent for a moment, then in a whisper, "They want me to remember." The second floor. The next day, Rebecca refused to go up to the attic. She stood at the base of the stairs and shook her head. "It's not locked up there," she said. "Not anymore." Ezekiel went up alone. Dust coated everything, old trunks, furniture covered in sheets, stacks of yellowed books. But the far corner caught his attention. There, beneath the slanted roof, was a child's bed. It looked untouched. A small wooden toy sat on the blanket, a carved horse missing its legs, and beside the bed, a dark stain on the floor. He crouched down, ran a finger across it, still sticky.
"The boy in the mirror that evening."
Rachel stopped in front of the tall mirror in the hallway. The cloth that had once covered it was gone. She stared at her reflection for a long time. Then slowly she reached out and tapped on the glass. Once, twice, 3 times. On the third knock, the reflection blinked. But Rachel didn't. Behind the mirror, something shifted. A face appeared, just for a second, a child's face. Twisted, mouth open like it was screaming. Rachel turned calmly and walked away. Later that night, she said one thing to her father before bed. "There's a boy in the mirror, but he's not really a boy anymore." Mrs. Bellwether's secret. The next morning, Ezekiel confronted Agnes. "There was a child in this house once," he said. "Someone you never told anyone about." Agnes looked away. "He was my nephew," she whispered, "Nathaniel. My sister died giving birth to him. I raised him here. But he wasn't like other boys." She hesitated. "He saw things, spoke to things, said they followed him. When he was 10, he went upstairs one night during a thunderstorm and never came back down." Ezekiel's voice was tight. "What did you do, Agnes?" She began to cry. "I bricked up the attic door. I covered every mirror. I burned the clothes he wore that night. But he still comes back. He still wants me to remember. What the twins saw that night was worse than any before." Doors slammed. The floor groaned under invisible footsteps. The parlour clock rang 12 times, even though it had no hands. In the guest room, Rebecca sat bolt upright. "He's coming out," she whispered. Rachel's voice was barely audible. "He's angry. He doesn't know he's dead." Just then, the air grew icy. Every candle blew out, and from the attic above came a loud crash as if furniture had been thrown across the room. Agnes screamed from downstairs. Rebecca and Rachel stood. "It's time," they said in unison. "The cleansing." Ezekiel gathered the family in the parlour. Rachel pulled the cloth off the largest mirror. The room grew colder instantly. In the glass, the flickering image of a boy appeared, his face bruised, eyes wide with pain. Rebecca stepped forward. "You were afraid," she said gently. "But it wasn't your fault. You were different, but you didn't deserve to be left behind," Rachel added. "You can rest now, Nathaniel. We remember." For a moment, the boy's expression softened. Then the mirror cracked. A long spiderweb fracture spread across the glass. A loud filled the room, like someone exhaling after holding their breath for years. And just like that, the weight lifted. The cold vanished. The creaking stopped. The house went quiet. The morning after. By dawn, the air smelled fresher, brighter. Agnes Bellwether looked 10 years older, but also lighter. Like someone who had finally confessed after a lifetime of hiding the truth, she hugged Rachel and Rebecca tightly. He was never evil," she whispered. "Just alone, and I left him there." Ezekiel placed a hand on her shoulder. "He's not alone now." They left Fairwood Gap before the sun reached the ridge. No one waved goodbye, but from the attic window, behind a cracked pane of glass, a small boy watched them go, his face peaceful at last.
Epilogue.
The journal entry. That evening, Ezekiel wrote in his journal, "Sometimes the dead do not want vengeance. They just want to be seen, to be heard, to be remembered. The girls do not fear these spirits, but I fear the day when something follows them that cannot be soothed, something not looking to be known but to consume. I pray that day never comes." In part 5, the Morrison family is invited to a plantation in western Kentucky, a place with wealth, power, and a secret buried in the soil itself. But what the twins find there will push even Ezekiel to the edge of belief. Certainly. Here's part 5 of the Morrison Twins story series, rewritten in simple, captivating language for a 20-minute dark mystery horror video targeting an American audience. This chapter continues the journey of Reverend Ezekiel and his daughters, now entering a world of wealth, control, and something far more sinister hidden beneath the surface. The Morrison Twins, Part 5, The Ashfield Plantation. In the late autumn of 1834, just days after leaving the haunted house in Fairwood Gap, the Morrison family received an invitation, a formal letter sealed with wax and written in elegant, careful script. To the Reverend Ezekiel Morrison and his daughters Rebecca and Rachel, we would be honoured to host you at Ashfield Manor. We have matters of spiritual concern that require your attention. Please come at once. Signed, Mrs. Constance Ashfield. The Ashfields were a name known across Kentucky. Wealthy, powerful and proud owners of one of the oldest plantations in the western region. But what troubled Ezekiel most was a single line at the end of the letter. We believe your daughters may be the only ones who can help.
The road to Ashfield.
The journey took nearly 3 days by wagon. The closer they got to Ashfield, the more uneasy Rachel became. She barely spoke, staring out at the woods as if watching something that walked between the trees. Rebecca clutched her sister's hand the night before they arrived. "It's louder here," she whispered. "What do you mean?" Ezekiel asked. "The ground," Rebecca replied. "It remembers everything." "The mansion on the hill!" Ashfield Plantation was a grand estate. Columns like white pillars reaching into the sky, wide porches wrapped around the house, and windows that watched like eyes. The house sat alone atop a hill, surrounded by hundreds of acres of cotton fields now barren for winter. The trees around it were twisted as if shaped by something unseen. Mrs. Constance Ashfield greeted them on the front steps. She was tall, thin, dressed in black silk despite the sun, and wore a necklace that looked like it hadn't been removed in decades. Her smile was polite, but her eyes were hollow. "Thank you for coming, Reverend. My family is unwell, and time is running out."
"Hush! The quiet servants!"
Inside the mansion, things felt off. The walls were too quiet, the house too clean. Servants moved silently through the halls, never meeting anyone's eyes. They looked as if they were trying not to breathe too loudly. Rachel whispered to her father during supper. "They don't sleep here," she said. "They hide." Constance sat at the long dinner table, cutting her meat with perfect grace. "We've had disturbances," she explained. "Whispers at night, shadows in mirrors, animals dying in the barn for no reason. But it's worse in the East Wing." She leaned in closer. "My husband died there, and I think my son is next." The boy in the locked room. The next morning, Rebecca and Rachel asked to see the East Wing. Constance hesitated, then led them down a long, cold hallway lined with faded portraits. At the end was a door with a rusted iron lock. Behind it was James Ashfield, aged 12. Pale, sickly and shaking. He hadn't spoken in days. "He says something comes to him at night," Constance said. "Something with nails instead of fingers." When Rachel sat beside him, James opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Tears streamed down his face. Rebecca leaned in. "You saw the well," she said. James nodded. Behind the mansion, down a forgotten slope near the tree line, there was a stone well, covered in vines, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. The girls found it without being told. "It's not just a well," Rachel said. "It's a mouth." Ezekiel pried the vines away and found iron bars covering the opening. Beneath them was only blackness, so deep it seemed bottomless. The air smelled wrong, like rot, ash, and something older. Rebecca placed her hand on the stones. "Someone was thrown in," she said, "but not before they cursed this place." The truth from Constance. That night, Ezekiel confronted Mrs. Ashfield. "There's something buried here," he said, "and it wasn't meant to be forgotten." Constance broke down. "It was before my time," she admitted. "My husband's grandfather, Elias Ashfield, was a cruel man. There was a girl, a house servant named Eliza. She was said to be gifted. People claimed she could heal, see dreams, speak to the dead. But when the baby she carried turned out to be Elias's, he denied it. He called her a witch, said she cursed the land. She was dragged out and thrown into the well, alive. The same night, every animal on the plantation either died or vanished."
"The dream that night."
That night, the girls shared a dream. In it, a woman with long braids and deep brown eyes stood beside the well. Her dress was torn, her face peaceful. She said only one thing: "He won't let me rest. The boy is mine." When Rebecca woke, her pillow was soaked with tears. Rachel's arms were covered in scratches, thin like claw marks, but not bleeding. She's trapped, Rachel said, but he's still here.
Elias! The seance!
Ezekiel prepared the parlour for what had to be done. Candles, salt, a circle drawn with ash. At the centre, a faded photo of Eliza that Constance had hidden in her father-in-law's belongings. The twins sat across from each other, hands linked. Rebecca began to speak. Eliza, we see you. You were wronged. Your pain is not forgotten. Rachel's voice joined in, softer but sharper. Elias Ashfield, you are seen. But your power ends tonight. The room grew cold. The fire died. A low moan echoed through the house as if the very walls were crying out. And then the chandelier fell, crashing to the floor, shattering into pieces. In its place, a figure appeared, tall, shadowed, wearing a plantation coat with hollow eyes and a twisted smile.
The reckoning!
Ezekiel stepped forward, Bible in hand. You have no dominion here, he said. But Elias spoke, not in words, but through James, the boy, who had come stumbling into the room. The boy's eyes rolled back. She was nothing, the voice snarled. A mongrel. She bled into my soil, and now I rule it. Rebecca's voice rang out. You don't rule anything. You hide in walls and steal breath. But she's not afraid of you anymore. The candles flared. The portrait of Elias above the fireplace cracked straight down the middle. Rachel stood and pointed to the window. Look, outside, at the well, the vines were burning.
With no fire in sight. Release.
James collapsed. The shadow vanished. The house went still. And somewhere, far off but clear, a woman's voice whispered, Thank you. In the morning, the well was nothing but a circle of scorched earth. The bars were melted. The air felt clean. James, for the first time in weeks, woke up hungry. The servants began singing softly in the kitchen again. One of them placed fresh lilies at the spot where the well had been without saying a word. Constance Ashfield gave Ezekiel a heavy envelope filled with cash. He refused it. Your debt wasn't to me, he said. It was to her.
Epilogue. Journal entry.
Evil doesn't always come with teeth and claws. Sometimes it wears fine clothes and hides behind walls built by money. But no curse lasts forever, not when truth is spoken. The girls grow quieter the deeper we travel. I worry something larger is drawing near, and I'm beginning to think they've known all along. Coming soon, Part 6, The Orphan's Cry. The Morrisons arrive at a burned-out orphanage in Tennessee, where the ghosts of children never learn to rest, and where Rachel may finally confront the voice that's been calling her since the very beginning. Part 6 of your dark mystery horror YouTube story series about the Morrison Twins. The Morrison Twins, Part 6, The Orphan's Cry. Modified in simple, compelling language for a 20-minute American audience narration. Introduction. The Ashes of Memory. It was just before Christmas 1834 when Reverend Ezekiel Morrison and his daughters Rebecca and Rachel arrived at the burned ruins of the Whitlock Orphanage, a place locals avoided even in daylight. The trees around it were blackened and twisted, the land dead and silent. There were no birds, no wind, no sound, and yet someone or something was still there.
Chapter 1.
A cold invitation. The invitation hadn't come on paper. It came as a story told in whispers by a frightened stable hand in Ashfield, just before the Morrisons left the plantation. There's a place up north, the man had said, shaking. A children's home. Burned down 3 years ago, but they say the crying never stopped. Ezekiel had tried to avoid it, but Rachel had already drawn the orphanage in her journal 2 nights before. Every brick, every window, every name of the children who had lived there. They're still waiting, she told her father. Someone needs to hear them. Chapter 2. The Burned House. Whitlock Orphanage was nothing more than a blackened frame, surrounded by ash and silence. It had burned in 1831 during a freezing winter night. 18 children had died in their beds. The building was never rebuilt. No graves were marked. Locals said the fire had started from a faulty chimney. Others whispered about something darker. Punishments, locked rooms, and screams after lights out. Rebecca stepped onto the grounds and whispered, They don't blame the fire. They blame her. Who? Ezekiel asked. Rachel looked up at the broken windows and answered, Matron Elspeth. Chapter 3. The Lady in the Red Shawl. They made camp inside the old chapel nearby, the only building still standing. That night, the girls didn't speak. They sat staring at the altar where candles had long ago melted into the floor. Then, just after midnight, Rachel sat up straight. She's watching. Rebecca turned to the wall. There, in the moonlight, stood a woman in a red shawl. Her eyes were cold. Her mouth never moved, but her voice filled the chapel like smoke. They disobeyed. They lied. They burned because I could not cleanse them. Ezekiel tried to speak scripture, but his words came out backward. Chapter 4. The Hidden Ledger. The next day, the girls found what the fire hadn't touched, a metal box buried beneath the chapel floorboards. Inside, a leather-bound book, singed around the edges. It was Matron Elspeth's ledger, filled with rules, punishments, and chilling entries. Whispers continue among the older girls. They speak of shadows that move at night. I've increased prayer time and cold baths. Boy number 6 continues to wake up screaming, claims to see the pale one by his bedside. I warned them, no child leaves unless they are pure. On the last page, only one sentence was written. The fire was mercy. Chapter 5. The Pale One. Rachel had a vision that night. She stood in the orphanage hallway, cold, silent, beds neatly made, children sleeping with blankets up to their chins. Then, one by one, they opened their eyes. Not scared. Awake. Empty. As if something else had entered them. Then she saw it. The Pale One. A tall, thin figure with no mouth, moving down the hallway. Its hands were long, fingers sharp. It didn't walk. It floated, barely brushing the floor. Wherever it passed, the blankets smoked. Rachel woke up choking on ash. He wasn't one of them, she said, but she let him in. Chapter 6. The Black Bedroom. Rebecca led the group into the only room still intact, Matron Elspeth's private quarters. The air was heavy, the floor burned, but the mirror remained untouched. Rachel stepped toward it. This is where she made them promise, she whispered. Ezekiel looked confused. Promise what? To obey her, even after death. Rebecca pointed to the mirror. Etched into the glass were the names of all 18 children who had died. None had last name, just Sarah, Thomas, Nellie, Joseph, Lila, and beneath them, scratched in a shaky hand, I keep them safe. Chapter 7. The Children. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, the chapel grew colder. Rebecca began to cry, not from fear, but from sorrow. They're here now. One by one, shapes appeared in the doorway. Our children, translucent, barely visible, but real. Some held rag dolls. One clutched a wooden horse. None spoke. Rachel walked to them and knelt. You're not alone. A boy stepped forward, his face pale and burned. She said if we left, we'd forget who we were. She lied, Rebecca said gently, and now it's time to remember. Matron returns. The air turned bitter. The walls shook. The chapel doors slammed shut. And Matron Elspeth returned. Her spirit stood in the pulpit where Ezekiel had been reading. Her shawl was now soaked with black water. Her eyes burned with fury. You don't belong here, she shrieked. These are my children, my rules, my redemption. The children behind Rachel backed away in fear. But Rebecca stood tall. You kept them trapped, not to protect them, but to control them. You're the one who brought the Pale One. Elspeth's face twisted. They would have gone to hell. You put them in hell, Rachel replied. Chapter 9. The Final Rite. Ezekiel stepped forward with his Bible. He began to speak, but Rachel interrupted him. This isn't a curse that can be broken with scripture. It's a promise that has to be undone. She reached into her pocket and took out a match. Rebecca poured oil across the chapel floor, tracing the names from the mirror in ash. She bound them with fire, Rachel whispered. We set them free the same way. As the flames rose, the children began to glow, each one slowly lifting into the air. The chapel burned, but this time no one screamed. Epilogue. Ashes to light. The next morning, nothing was left but stone and ashes. But on the ground, Ezekiel found something strange. 18 white feathers. Clean. Untouched by fire. Rebecca picked one up and smiled. She's gone now, she said. What about the Pale One? Ezekiel asked. Rachel turned toward the woods where shadows still moved. He's looking for another place to hide. Ezekiel placed the ledger in his satchel. Then we keep moving. There's more to be done. And with that, the Morrison family walked into the morning fog, unaware that the most dangerous secret was yet to come. Coming soon, Part 7, The Hollow-Eyed Widow. A remote Tennessee valley. A widow who hasn't aged in 30 years. And a house where time itself seems broken. part 7 of your dark mystery horror YouTube series on the Morrison Twins. The Morrison Twins, part 7, The Hollow-Eyed Widow, written in clear, atmospheric storytelling for a 20-minute American audience narration. Introduction. Fog in the Valley. After the fire at the Whitlock orphanage, the Morrison family didn't speak of what happened. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Some truths needed no retelling. Their next destination was unplanned. They had intended to head west toward Tennessee's flatter country, but Rachel pointed to a path no one had marked on any map. "We need to go where the clock doesn't move," she said. And so they found themselves in Morrow Valley, a small fog-covered hollow nestled deep in the Smoky Mountains, where time itself had gone wrong. Chapter 1. The House at the Edge. Locals refused to speak of Morrow Valley. The few who remembered it called it a ghost valley, a place where the seasons didn't change and the dead didn't stay quiet. The Mauritians arrived at dusk. The sky was pale. The air had no scent. There were no birds, no insects, just the heavy quiet of land that had given up on growing. At the far end of the valley stood a white farmhouse, weathered but not broken. The windows were closed, the curtains still, but a light flickered behind the glass. Rebecca tilted her head. "She's been waiting." "Who?" Ezekiel asked. "The widow who doesn't sleep." Chapter 2. Widow Morrow. Her name was Agnes Morrow, once the proud wife of the valley's wealthiest landowner. Her husband died in 1805, or so the story went. But according to the only living neighbour, an old trapper named Glenn who lived miles away, Agnes was still alive, and she hadn't aged a day. "I saw her in town back in 22, Glenn had said. Same black dress, same pale hands, eyes like dried-up wells. No one else in the county had seen her in decades. No mail, no visitors, just the occasional light seen in the attic on moonless nights. Ezekiel felt uneasy, but Rachel insisted. "She's not the danger," she whispered. "It's what she kept in the cellar." Chapter 3. The Room with No Dust. The Mauritians knocked on the door to answer, but the door creaked open by itself. Inside, the air was perfectly still. No dust, no cobwebs. A fire burned in the hearth. A kettle sat warm on the stove. Then they saw her. Agnes Morrow stood at the top of the stairs, dressed in widow's black, her hands folded neatly. Her hair was grey, but her face smooth, ageless, hollow. "You came," she said, not surprised. Her voice was dry as paper. "I thought it would be the twins. I always knew it would be the twins." Ezekiel stepped forward, cautious but calm. "How long have you lived alone, ma'am?" "Since the clock stopped ticking." Chapter 4. The Broken Clocks. All across the house were clocks. Big ones, small ones, carved wooden clocks, pocket watches, grandfather clocks. Not a single one worked, but all their hands pointed to 3:13. "They stopped the night James came back," she said. "Your husband?" Ezekiel asked. "Not anymore." She led them to the parlour, where a portrait of a man hung crooked on the wall. His face was painted with strange shadows. His eyes were scratched out. Rachel stared at it, then turned to the wall beside the painting. She touched it gently and said, "There's something behind this." Agnes nodded. "The room no one enters." Chapter 5. The Sealed Door. Behind the portrait was a hidden door, wooden, reinforced with iron. It had no knob, just a slot, like a mail chute sealed tight with rust. "He built it when the voices started," Agnes whispered. She handed them a small silver key that hung from her necklace. "I never opened it. I was afraid I'd let him out." Rebecca stared at the key. "He's not inside," she said softly. "What he brought back is." When the key turned, a sudden cold wind rushed through the room. The door opened slowly, revealing a staircase descending into blackness. They lit a lantern and stepped inside. Chapter 6. The Stone Cellar. The cellar was carved from bedrock. The air was thick and damp. Along the walls were strange symbols drawn in red. Some were faded, some still fresh. In the centre of the room was a cot covered in chains. A journal lay beside it. "James Morrow's journal," Ezekiel read aloud. Inside, the handwriting grew increasingly erratic. "The war didn't end for me. They followed me home. They speak when I close my eyes. The twins, the children, the third is coming." On the last page, James had scrawled, "It wears a human face, but its eyes are wrong." And underneath, "If I vanish, do not look for me. Seal the room. Burn the key." Chapter 7. The Thing in the Attic. The cellar door slammed shut behind them, but before panic could take hold, a soft cry echoed from above. A child's cry. Rachel froze. "It's in the attic now." They rushed back up the stairs through the silent parlour and climbed to the top floor. The attic was filled with trunks, old furniture, and moth-eaten linens. In the corner sat a rocking chair. It moved slowly, rhythmically, and in it sat a child no older than 4, pale, thin, with deep black hollows where his eyes should have been. Rebecca reached for her father's hand. "It's not a boy," she whispered. "It never was."
Chapter 8.
Agnes's secret. Agnes appeared behind them. "I tried to raise it," she said. "I thought maybe if I showed it love, it would stop." "What is it?" Ezekiel asked. "It's what came back from the dead, but it wears my husband's voice. Sometimes it pretends to be the boy we lost." The child thing smiled, but its teeth were sharp. Rachel stepped forward. "Why did you keep it?" "Because it told me if I didn't, it would go find another family." Rebecca pointed to the floor, where black mold had begun to grow in a perfect circle. "It's ready to move again." Chapter 9. The Mirror Binding. Rachel pulled a shard of mirror from her satchel. She placed it in front of the child thing. It hissed and shrank back. "It can't stand its own reflection," she said. Ezekiel began reading from his Bible, voice strong. Rebecca traced a salt circle around the rocking chair. "It's not just a spirit," she whispered. "It's a parasite. It feeds on grief." Agnes fell to her knees. "Take it away. I can't do this anymore." Rachel looked at her. "You already did, the moment you let it in." The child thing screamed as the light from the mirror grew brighter, swallowing it in a blaze of silver. And then silence.
Epilogue. The time returns.
The next morning, the clocks in Agnes's house all began ticking again. One by one. Tick, tick, tick. Each pointed to the correct time. Even the old grandfather clock in the hallway struck its first chime in over 30 years. Agnes sat by the fire, older now, her skin wrinkled, her hair fully white. "It's finally over," she said. "For you," Ezekiel replied. Rachel and Rebecca stood in the doorway. But something else is beginning. Coming soon, Part 8, The Bell Tower Secret. A mountain town with no birds, a church bell that rings without hands, and a truth buried beneath the steeple. Of your dark mystery horror series about the Morrison Twins. The Morrison Twins Part 8, The Bell Tower Secret. Modified for a simple, eerie, and captivating 20-minute narration for an American audience. The Mauritians didn't stay long in Morrow Valley after what happened with the child thing in the attic. Agnes Morrow was finally free, but her house would never feel clean again. Rebecca and Rachel both agreed. It had attached itself to her sorrow, and sorrow has a way of calling other things. By late October of 1835, they made their way farther east into the hills of Maple Hollow, a town so small it didn't appear on any official maps, just a bell tower, a post office that hadn't opened in months, and a church built into the mountain rock itself. From a distance, it looked peaceful, but something was terribly wrong. Chapter 1. The Town Without Birds. The first thing Ezekiel noticed about Maple Hollow was the silence. There were no birds, no crows in the trees, no sparrows on the fence posts, just a constant wind that passed through like breath through a crypt. The town sat in the shadow of St. Uriel's church, its tall bell tower rising like a warning finger to the sky. It had no clock, but the bell rang every morning at exactly 6 a.m., even though no one had lived in the church for 5 years. "Who rings the bell?" Ezekiel asked a man chopping wood by the road. The man shook his head without looking up. "Don't ask questions you don't want answers to, preacher." Chapter 2. The Church Carved in Stone. St. Uriel's wasn't like the wooden churches Ezekiel had known. It had been chiselled into the cliffside, a mix of stone and shale, with carvings that had faded from age. The door was unlocked. No one stopped them from entering. Inside it was cool and dark. Candles still stood in their holders, long melted to stubs. Pews remained neatly arranged. Dust coated everything, but the air was thick, heavy, as if it hadn't moved in years. Then Rachel looked up. "There's someone in the bell tower." Rebecca followed her gaze. "He watches when people lie."
Chapter 3. The Disgraced Priest.
That evening, they stayed with a schoolteacher named Mrs. Delaney, one of the few in town who dared to speak freely. She explained that the church once had a priest named Father Grayson, a stern man, knows beautiful sermons, and his cruelty behind closed doors. Um, he judged everyone, she said, but never himself. Rumour had it he disappeared 5 years ago after a scandal involving 3 missing children. The town buried it quickly. No bodies were found. No charges were filed. After he vanished, the bell kept ringing every morning, Mrs. Delaney whispered. Always at 6, always just once. Did anyone go to look? Ezekiel asked. One man did, she said. He came. Blame damp, chapter 4. The bell rings at dawn. The next morning, just before sunrise, the Mauritians waited outside the church. Sure enough, as the clock struck 6, the old iron bell rang out across the hollow just once, a deep, hollow toll that seemed to come from inside the bones. But the bell rope had been cut years ago, according to town records, and no one had gone into the tower since the priest vanished. Rebecca stared at the door to the tower staircase. He didn't vanish, she whispered. He was taken. By what? Ezekiel asked. By the one who judges the judges. Chapter of the climb. That afternoon, Ezekiel and the girls returned to the church. With lanterns lit, they found the sealed wooden door that led to the bell tower stairs. Rachel placed her hand on the wood. There's something behind this door that hasn't moved in years, but it's listening. Rebecca touched the iron latch. It creaked open. Inside, the staircase spiraled tightly, carved directly into the stone. The air grew colder with each step. Dust clung to the walls, but no cobwebs. At the top, they found the bell chamber. The great bronze bell sat still, dustless, as if someone cleaned it daily, and behind it, a figure crouched in the shadows. Chapter 6. The Bellkeeper. It was a man, or it used to be. He was thin, almost skeletal, his eyes milky and white. He wore a priest's collar, his mouth opened but no words came. Instead, the bell chimed on its own. Rebecca covered her ears. Rachel wept silently. Ezekiel stepped forward. Father Grayson? The figure twitched. I judged too harshly, he rasped, and then I saw what comes after judgment. Behind him, on the wall, someone had scratched a message into the stone. He who rings the bell cannot leave. He who silences it takes his place. Rachel turned to her father. It's a trap for priests.
Chapter 7.
The Eyes of the Mountain. The bell wasn't just a bell. Rachel explained it was a binding object, a kind of spiritual cage that held something beneath the church, something ancient. The more the bell rang, the tighter the prison. But if it ever stopped ringing... It wakes, Rebecca said. It remembers what was done to it. At the base of the tower was a small hatch door. Beneath it, a narrow tunnel led deeper into the mountain. They followed it. It opened into a cavern carved into the stone. And in the centre of the cavern was a stone altar covered in children's names. 3 of them were fresh.
Chapter 8.
The sacrifice. Father Grayson's crimes were worse than anyone guessed. He hadn't just hidden the children. He had offered them to something beneath the church, an ancient force older than any religion. Rebecca knelt by the altar. It wanted justice, she said, but he twisted it into something else. Rachel whispered that it had once been a protector, a spirit of the mountain that watched over lost travellers. But over the years, with blood and lies, it had been turned into something cruel. Ezekiel stared at the bell tower above them, and the bell keeps it chained, but the chain was rusted and breaking.
Chapter 9.
The final toll. That night, the townsfolk gathered outside the church after the Morrison twins asked them to come. For the first time in years, the truth was spoken aloud. Mrs. Delaney, weeping, admitted she had helped hide the priest's sins. Several others came forward with stories of children who vanished or strange noises beneath the church. As the truth came to light, the bell began to ring wildly on its own, again and again, louder each time. Rebecca raised her hands and shouted, "It's not the truth that frees it, it's the justice." Rachel stood beneath the bell and spoke directly to the force below. "You've been waiting for someone to ring the bell for the right reason." Then she pulled the rope. Once. Only once. A hollow restored. After that night, the bell never rang again. But the mountain didn't collapse. The sky didn't darken. Instead, the birds came back. The trees turned colour. For the first time in 5 years, Maple Hollow saw a real sunrise. The church was sealed, the tunnel filled with stone. Father Grayson's body was found sitting peacefully in the bell chamber, eyes closed. No one dared move him. Rebecca and Rachel stood at the edge of town that morning, staring at the newly carved stone placed outside the church. It read, "Justice isn't revenge, it's truth without cruelty." They never spoke of Maple Hollow again.
Coming soon. Part 9.
The Portrait in the Well, a forgotten farm. A well that echoes with voices, and a painted face that ages while its owner does not. Here's part 9 of your dark, eerie series about the Morrison Twins. It's tailored for a 20-minute YouTube storytelling video for an American audience. Simple, atmospheric, and gripping. The Morrison Twins, part 9, The Portrait in the Well. After Maple Hollow, the Morrison family kept moving deeper into the Appalachian wilderness, where the ridgelines blurred between map and memory. Their travels brought them to a forgotten corner of Clay County, Kentucky, an area locals simply called Miller's Run. There were no churches here, no schoolhouses, no shops, just one crooked road leading to a crumbling farmhouse at the edge of a dry cornfield, and an old stone well that had long since fallen into disuse. But something still stirred in the depths of that well, something that remembered every face that ever looked down into its darkness. Chapter 1, The House That Waited. The house was known as the Callahan Farm, though no one named Callahan had lived there in over 60 years. When Ezekiel knocked on the crooked front door, an old woman answered. Her name was Lenora Briggs, and she'd lived on the property alone for most of her life. The townspeople called her a witch, but not out of fear, out of caution. They didn't hate her, but they didn't help her either. She let the Morrisons in without hesitation. "I've been waiting for you," she said softly, staring directly at Rachel. "You've come about the well, haven't you?"
Chapter 2, The Dry Well That Whispers.
Out behind the house, tucked between dead trees and half-collapsed fences, stood an ancient stone well. Its rope and bucket were long gone. The stones were stained with time and moss. Rebecca stood over it, peering into the black. She listened, then looked up sharply. "It's speaking," she said, but not with words. Lenora explained that every family who had lived on the farm eventually left or vanished. And always, before they did, someone would claim they saw their reflection in the well water, but it was never their current face. "It showed them as they truly were," Lenora whispered, "not who they pretended to be." Chapter 3, The First Portrait. Inside the farmhouse, above the stone fireplace, hung a large oil painting in an ornate gold frame. It depicted a man in 1800s clothing, proud, stern, and unmistakably smug. "His name was Silas Callahan," Lenora said. "He was the original owner of the property. A plantation heir from Virginia who moved west after his family's wealth began to crumble. Silas had a gift," the stories claimed. "He could tell when someone was lying. Some said he used that gift for good. Others said he used it to manipulate, blackmail, and destroy anyone who crossed him. The strange part? The portrait still looked brand new. The paint wasn't cracked. The eyes looked wet, and over the years, the face had changed."
Chapter 4, The Changing Face.
According to Lenora, the face in the painting slowly aged on its own. No one ever touched it. At first, Silas had looked like a man in his 40s, but now he looked older, more withered, his eyes sunken, his mouth curled in a permanent sneer. And once, just once, Lenora swore she saw his lips move. Rebecca stared at the painting for a long time. "He's not inside the painting," she finally said. "He's watching through it." Rachel added, "The well feeds him." "Feeds him what?" Ezekiel asked. "Time." Chapter 5, The Diary in the Walls. That night, as wind howled outside the creaking house, the twins explored the attic with a lantern. Behind a panel of rotted wood, they found an old, leather-bound diary. It belonged to Mary Ann Callahan, Silas's niece. The final entries chilled them. "He made me look into the well again. It showed me my own funeral. He says the portrait must be protected, that if it's damaged, he'll die too. I hope he does. The well is not dry. It drinks us instead." Rebecca slowly closed the book. "She tried to destroy the portrait," she said. "And she paid the price."
Chapter 6,
The Truth in the Water. At dawn, Rachel returned to the well with Lenora and Ezekiel. They lowered a new bucket down, though the well was said to be dry. And when it came up again, it was full, but not of water. The bucket held black liquid, thick as tar, Floating in it was a single object, a silver locket. Inside was a miniature painting of Mary Ann Callahan. Rachel stared into the dark water and began to whisper, "It only shows what's hidden, the truth we won't admit." Suddenly the wind stopped, the trees fell silent, and Rachel turned to her father. "We have to burn the painting."
Chapter 7. The Fire and the Screams.
Ezekiel didn't hesitate. He took the painting down, though it resisted in ways that defied explanation. The frame felt cold the canvas pulsed like skin. As he dragged it into the field, the house groaned behind him. Lenora clutched her chest. "He knows," she gasped. "He's in the walls." Ezekiel lit the fire. The dry cornstalks ignited quickly. The moment the flames touched the portrait, a scream rang out, not from the painting, but from the well. It echoed like a wounded animal, shaking the earth. Black smoke poured from the stones, rising into the sky, and the portrait melted like wax. Chapter 8. The well seals itself. After the fire died down, the well looked different. Its stones had cracked. The hole collapsed inward. By sunset, nothing remained but a pile of rubble. Inside the house, the space above the fireplace was empty, as nothing had ever hung there. Lenora wept, not from sadness, but from relief. "He's gone," she whispered. "He's finally gone." But Rebecca shook her head. "He's not gone, just sleeping deeper now. The truth will always find a mirror," Rachel added softly. "Some wells go dry, others just get quieter."
Epilogue, the new reflection. Before leaving the farm,
Rachel approached the mirror in Lenora's bedroom. She looked at her reflection. But for a split second, the face staring back wasn't hers. It was Silas Callahan, old, angry, afraid, and then it vanished. Coming soon, Part 10, The Hollowing. The final chapter, a return to Pine Hollow, secrets unearthed, and the terrible price of knowing too much. Part 10, the final chapter of your dark historical mystery series about the Morrison Twins, written in a detailed, atmospheric, and simple way, perfect for a 20-minute storytelling video for an American audience. The Morrison Twins, Part 10, The Hollowing. Some places don't just keep secrets, they become them. This is how the final journey began for Ezekiel Morrison and his two extraordinary daughters, Rebecca and Rachel. After everything they had witnessed, from haunted bell towers to portraits that aged with stolen time, they knew their work was nearly done. But something had been calling them back to where it all began, back to Pine Hollow. Return to the beginning. The air in Pine Hollow hadn't changed. The mist still clung to the hills like smoke from an unseen fire. The old wooden church stood weathered but whole, its windows dark, the steeple leaning slightly more than it had a year before. Pastor William Phillips, now a man hollowed by knowledge, stood on the steps waiting for them. He didn't smile. "You shouldn't have come back," he said quietly. "Some things stay buried for a reason." Ezekiel simply nodded. "It's time, Pastor. We were never supposed to leave this unfinished." Chapter 2. The Grave Without a Name. They went first to the cemetery behind the church. It was there, beneath a patch of unmarked ground, that the Whitman family had been buried in secret. The truth had been exposed the year prior: murder, betrayal, cover-up. And though the community had tried to heal, something still hung heavy in the air. Rachel stood silently over the ground. "They were never put to rest," she said, "because part of them is still in church." Rebecca turned to Ezekiel. "We need to open the floor." The board beneath the altar. That night, by lantern light, they returned to the altar. The floorboards creaked underfoot, dust swirled in the stale air. The third board from the centre, the same one where the pastor had once hidden his secret bottle, came loose with ease. But what lay beneath was not a bottle. It was bone. Small bones, children's bones, wrapped in the faded remains of a blue dress. Rebecca reached down but stopped short. "This isn't just a grave," she said. "It's a tether." Rachel's voice followed, soft and steady. "Their pain is still here, because something fed on it." Chapter 4. The Hollowing. The twins explained it clearly that night. There was something ancient below Pine Hollow, older than the church, older than the town. It wasn't a ghost, it wasn't a demon. It was a hollow, a spiritual wound left in the earth when terrible things are done in secret and never acknowledged. "Every lie told here," Rebecca said. Every truth ignored, every sin buried, it all sunk into the ground. And the hollow had begun to awaken, not as a creature, but as a hunger.
Chapter 5. The night the air turned cold.
The townspeople gathered once again in the church, just like they had during that first visit. But this time no one laughed at the girls, no one doubted. Everyone remembered what had happened, what they had seen, what the girls had revealed. Rebecca stood before the altar and lit a single candle. This church was meant for worship, she said, but it became a place of hiding and shame and fear. Rachel added, the hollow wants what was taken. It wants truth, real truth, even if it hurts. Then the wind stopped outside and the ground trembled beneath their feet. Chapter 6. The Confessions. One by one, members of the congregation came forward. Not forced, not shamed, but moved. Elder Thompson finally spoke aloud what he'd hidden for decades, that he'd helped silence Mary Whitman's screams. Mrs. Whitfield confessed she knew about the altar cover-up and said nothing. Even Pastor Phillips, tears running down his face, admitted that he'd once seen the aftermath and walked away, choosing comfort over justice. With every confession, the church groaned like a ship at sea, and below them, something shifted, something released. Chapter 7. The Collapse. Suddenly, the altar split down the middle. A deep fissure opened beneath it, revealing a tunnel carved not by man, but by something older. Rachel leaned forward and whispered, "This is its mouth." Rebecca took her sister's hand, "And we're going to close it." Together, they knelt at the edge and began to speak, not in English, not in any known tongue, but in a rhythm that sounded older than language. The candle flames flickered violently. And then the hollow screamed. Chapter 8.
What they gave up.
As the sound roared through the church, Ezekiel rushed to his daughters, but they didn't move. Their eyes were closed, their mouths were open in chant, and suddenly it stopped. Silence. The crack in the floor sealed itself. The air returned. The church stood still again, but Rebecca and Rachel remained on the ground. When Ezekiel reached them, they were breathing, but different. Something had left them, and something had stayed behind.
Chapter 9. The morning after.
The next day, the sun rose over Pine Hollow for the first time in a week. The birds sang again. The mist lifted. The old wooden church, once haunted by silence and secrecy, felt like a house of worship again. The townspeople gathered to rebuild the altar, not to forget what had happened, but to honour it, to remember. Ezekiel stood at the front steps, holding both girls' hands. They were quiet. But they smiled. Epilogue, the final entry. Pastor Phillips returned to his journal that night. His final entry reads, "The Morrison family left today. The girls did not speak much, but I believe they've done what they came to do. The hollow is no more. They don't just see what others hide, they carry it, they understand it, and when the burden becomes too great, they move on, but not without leaving us better than they found us. I will never forget them. None of us will." The Morrison Twins story ends here, for now. But across the hills of Kentucky, Tennessee and beyond, there are still places where the air feels wrong, where secrets linger, and where two quiet girls walking beside their tired father might one day knock on someone's door to help them face the truth before it eats them alive.